Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier, and this Paper 2 presentation deals with the last question on your source paper, the big one, the one that requires you to use all the sources, and the one that carries the most marks. Now all this is true, and that's how question 6 is generally seen. But I'm going to suggest it's not that big. It only carries 4 or 5 more marks, and you've already scored really high marks with the other 5 questions. So don't get carried away with it. Now that's already my first piece of advice. And I'll add, as I always do with these Paper 2 presentations, that I'm sure you'll be pressing the pause button on this one, and that I think you'd be better watching it on your laptop. My second piece of advice, as with every question really, is to read the question carefully. In the left-hand box are 2 examples of past questions, but you should look out for key words that you might need to focus on when you get down to answering the question. And this is what I do in the right-hand box. First, I'll make sure I have the focus of the question clear in my mind. In the first question, it's what influenced the Soviet decision to use force in Hungary. Was it only because of what was happening in Hungary, or were other factors involved? And the second question is whether Soviet armed intervention was justified or not. But there's more to make sure you are clear about. Do the sources provide convincing evidence or not? This will include what the sources tell us, of course, but also whether the sources are trustworthy. So we're back on familiar territory. The author, the message, the purpose, and the audience of the sources. So, you are going to use the sources to explain your judgments. Now, most of this is written into every question 6. Indeed, it's implicit in every source question. So you should be well practiced. But still, make sure you are focused. This is the last question on a 2-hour paper. Read the question carefully. Now I'm going to move away from any specific question and use the level bands from the mark schemes to try and show you what you need to do to build great marks for this last question. And I'll begin with the mark bands you don't want your answer to fall into. Level 0, no evidence submitted or the response does not address the question. Or level 1, when no valid use is made of the sources. This is why a little thinking right at the start helps you look for the things in the sources you need. And again, as with all other source questions, you must make direct reference to the sources. This is a source paper, and you are told to do just that. And if you don't, you can't expect to score well. I actually think the level 1 score, when no valid use is made of the sources, is actually generous at 1 to 3 marks. So, having avoided the worst possible score, how do we target a top score? Some initial points. You can deal with the sources in a straightforward manner, starting with the first and ending with the last, and explaining how they fall on each side of the debate. And you can score really good marks with this approach. But I think it's better if you group the sources into 2 arguments, and you can do this in 1 of 2 ways. You could read the last question first when you start the exam. Don't answer it, but be aware of it. And as you go through the rest of the questions, put a Y if they do provide convincing evidence of whatever it is, or an N if they don't. If you find it's breaking your concentration for some of the other questions, then stop. You will still be speeding things up a little when you get to that last question. Or, if you have been managing your timing well, you can quickly go through the sources. And remember, you've already read them all for the other questions. And mark each with a Y, they do provide convincing evidence, or an N if they don't. The advantage of either of these approaches is that it makes it easier for you to develop two alternative arguments, and that makes it easier for the examiner to follow them. The next point to make is that you must use all the sources. The examiners will be looking out for this. They'll tick them off as you use them. And these questions do begin with the words, study all the sources. However, it is unlikely that there will be an even split as to how the sources support each side of the debate, even if there are an even number of sources. So don't worry about trying to ensure a balance. The other thing to say here is that even if you have fewer sources to support your conclusion, just explain why they are more convincing evidence. And the third point to make is that you might find one source could be used on both sides of the debate. If that happens in your exam, you must make your decision which argument you will use it for. Don't use it for both. I hope I've made these points as clear as possible for you. Level 2 is for answers that use sources to support or reject the statement, and it scores 4 to 6 marks. You're getting up to half marks if you've only produced half an answer, but that suggests you've run out of time. Manage your time throughout the exam. There are only 4 or 5 more marks in this last question than in the other 5 questions. So I would suggest you give yourself 20 minutes for each of questions 1 to 5 and mark your finishing times for each question on the exam paper. It'll only take half a minute, and that gives you 30 minutes for this last question. But, and I say this with a smile on my face, try and dip under your 20-minute allocations where you can. And while I'm at it, if you want to manage your time across the whole paper, don't waste time looking at all the sources at the beginning. Just deal with the source or sources that each question requires. The others can wait until you get to that question. And this is not a contradiction to what I said on the previous slide about question 6. Now, you will do very well to get more than half marks if you only present one argument, one perspective, and you want to do better than that. So what do you do if you are running out of time? 2 things. Make sure you explain how at least 2 sources supporting each side of the debate. Explain them, and then at least identify where you think the rest of the sources fall in the debate. That way, you have used all the sources, explained why you think half of them support either one side of the debate or the other, and at least indicated where you think the rest fall. And you don't have to write at length for each source. There might be as many as 8 sources, and you only earn 12 marks. so they can't expect more than one point clearly explained for each source. But how do you get maximum marks? Go back to everything I highlighted in the questions. Stay close to the focus of the question. Use all the sources to explain your reasoning. Explain how the source supports two different viewpoints. It's there in the instructions to the questions. And do note the mark schemes are very clear in requiring references to a source by letter, provenance, or by direct quote. It's no different to what you've been doing in the other questions. And finally, we have noted that the question clearly refers to convincing evidence, and this might lead you to question some of the sources. That's great, you'll get rewarded for that. But only do this if there is something that jumps out at you. Only do it for two sources as well. It won't be appropriate to do it for every source anyway, and you won't have the time. The examiners are instructed to give you up to 2 marks for evaluating the merit of sources, but no more than 1 mark per source. So the maths is simple. Evaluate the merits, usefulness, trustworthiness, or whatever of 2 sources, and do make sure you reach a conclusion as well. How far or to what extent do they provide convincing evidence? Overwhelmingly, largely, on the whole, to some extent, not convincingly, or not at all. I don't think you'll have either of the 2 extremes, but they're there to show you a full range of possible conclusions. So there you have it, a long presentation, and I hope any stumbling on my part hasn't put you off. I'll put my script on my website to help you. A big good luck with your Paper 2 exam, and a final reassurance that I am sure it will be a winner for you. And maybe this is my final chance to thank you for listening. I hope it's been useful for you. Cheers.